and now my computer does as well. So as people are getting onto the phone, I'll go ahead and do a little housekeeping. Thank you all for joining us. This has been a very popular webinar, so I'm really excited to hear from our presenters today. And we'll go through the presentations, and then we will have questions at the end. So think about questions that you might want to ask. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. As people are getting ready, I just want to say that everybody is in mute at the moment except for the panelists. Again, we will be taking questions at the end of the presentation, but you can submit a question at any point by typing it into the chat window. And if you don't see the chat window, you might need to look for the little orange arrow in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, and that will pull out the dashboard, and there should be a chat window in there, and you can type in your question. So we'll take those at the end. We're also recording this webinar, so you'll be able to access the information afterwards, or you can pass it on to someone else. And we'll have the webinar up on the SSTI website tomorrow. So first, for anyone who is not familiar with SSTI, we are a network of reform-minded DOTs. We've been around since 2010, and we are a partnership between Smart Growth America and the University of Wisconsin. We operate in three ways. We are an executive level community of practice for state DOTs. You can see the map of the states we're currently working with. We get them together about once a year to talk amongst themselves and come up with innovative solutions to problems. We also do technical assistance with some of these states, and now also some regional governments or cities as well. And we're a resource for the larger transportation community with our newsletter, resources on our website, and webinars such as this. You can find out more about SSTI on our website at ssti.us. And our speakers today will be first Chris McCahill, who is an associate researcher here at SSTI. And he came to us with a PhD in engineering from the University of Connecticut and several publications already on parking in the urban environment. He's recently been working on new measures for accessibility and trip making using GIS and big data. And we have several webinars on those topics on our website already. So if you're interested in those topics, you can search those out. We'll next be hearing from Jennifer Boldry, who is the Director of Research for People for Bikes. And that means her job is to connect the dots between great places to ride and the ridership of all kinds. She aggregates and synthesizes secondary research as well as directs the primary research program. Her background is in statistical modeling and has extensive experience applying her methodological expertise to help with outdoor, bike, run, and snow sports companies to help grow their businesses and industries. Finally, we'll be hearing from Spencer Gardner, who is a project planner at Toole Design Group, and he worked with People for Bikes on this project as the planner. And he has more than 4 years of experience assisting communities with multimodal transportation plans. In addition to his efforts on bike and pedestrian issues, he's worked on for a number of transit agencies and understands the challenges and opportunities for building a well-connected and multimodal transportation system. I want to thank all of our presenters because this is going to be a wonderful presentation. This is really cutting edge information. And I think a lot of people, the number of people signed up is a sign of how interested people are in this topic. So Chris, I'm going to go ahead and give you control of the slides and you can go ahead.
Great. Thanks, Robbie. So I'm going to kick things off just by talking first a little bit about what it is to measure accessibility, focus in on pedestrian accessibility with a little bit of work we've been doing here at SSTI. and sort of cover how that actually fits into transportation decision making, something that we work on a lot here. First off, why measure accessibility, right? So when we measure transportation system performance, we usually use what are called mobility measures. So we'll look at a particular road in the system and measure things like travel speed or level of service or vehicle throughput, sometimes person throughput. But in any of those cases, we're just looking at one little piece of the system and seeing how well it moves vehicles or people. Obviously, accessibility is about much more than that. So we're really interested in more. We need to understand where people might be starting trips, where they might be ending their trips, and how easy it is to travel between them. We also need to be able to do this for multiple modes, right? So for folks that are driving, obviously the speed of that road and the capacity to handle vehicles is an important piece of their accessibility. But for folks that are trying to walk or bike along those roads or across those roads, the speed isn't necessarily as important as how safe and comfortable and even possible to cross those pieces of the network are. So with accessibility, we have to be able to capture all those things. When we're talking about accessibility measures here, we typically talk about two different measures. The first is access to jobs, typically by automobile and by transit. So this is a sort of regional measure about how many jobs you can reach throughout the region. And then the second one is access to non-work destinations. We usually consider this by walking, but you can also do it by biking. And this tends to be more of a local measure, right? How much stuff can you get to within a really close distance of where you are? These two measures are reported a little bit differently. So for example, we might say that a person can reach 30,000 jobs by transit, and their non-work access score is 60 out of 100. So you see the non-work access score is reported as a number, a score from 0 to 100, much like the WalkScore website, which probably a lot of you are familiar with. And the access to job score is reported as how many jobs you can reach. So what exactly does that mean? Well, sometimes we establish a travel time cutoff, like 30 minutes. We ask, how many jobs can you reach within 30 minutes? And the answer might be 30,000. What we usually do here is use a decay function. So this recognizes the fact that nearby destinations carry more weight than ones that are further away. So a job that's 45 minutes away might only count for 50%, right? So when we're totaling up how many jobs we can reach, that 45-minute job would only count as half a job. So this 30,000 jobs number includes counting up jobs that way with weights, depending on how far away they are. We know this from travel surveys. So for this particular region, we looked and saw that only 50% of people are willing to travel 45 minutes or longer. So that's how we understand the utility of a job that's that far away. And this could vary by region, mode, and trip purpose. If you're interested in understanding how this works, we can obviously offer resources, but just so you understand what's going on behind the scenes here. Another important thing to notice is that walking is a key part in many places of these measures. It's obviously important in measuring access to non-work destinations by walking, but it's also really important in measuring access to jobs by transit because when we're measuring access by transit, we're including those walk connections to and from the stations, the first and last mile connections. And it turns out those are really important in measuring transit accessibility. Just so you get a sense of how these measures work, this is what access to jobs by transit looks like in Virginia, in Northern Virginia, where we've done a lot of work. So for each census block, this map is showing how many jobs the average person can reach during the morning commute period. And that's using the actual transit routes and schedules. So you can see folks living very close to DC and Arlington can reach something like 300,000 jobs by transit during that morning rush hour period. And that drops off depending on where you are. It's high closer to job centers and where you have access to high speed, frequent transit service. For the same area, this map shows non-work accessibility by walking. And this paints a different picture. The places that light up here are places that have lots of different destinations, grocery stores, parks, schools, restaurants, and other non-work destinations that are easy to walk to. As I mentioned, this is often reported as a score from 0 to 100. Well, what kind of tools are out there for doing this kind of stuff? So the Accessibility Observatory at the University of Minnesota has been pretty much a leader in measuring accessibility for a handful of years now. And they provide nationwide accessibility reports, measuring access to jobs by automobile, transit, and walking. So this is sort of a good way to compare regions and sort of a benchmark for tracking changes over time and things like that. If you want to do some of these measurements yourself, there are tools like Open Trip Planner, Conveil, and Urban Access. These are open source tools for measuring transit accessibility and including those walk-bike connections at the beginning and the end of the trips. There's also, of course, People for Bikes Bike Network Analysis Score, an open source tool for measuring bike accessibility, and you'll learn a bunch more about this in the second part of our webinar. And there's Sugar Access by City Labs, which is the tool that we've used for all the work that we're showing here. It does have paid data included with it. This is data coming from a company called Here, which used to be Navtech. So this is the data that's in a lot of the GPS navigational units that you might use. It also operates as an ArcGIS extension using their Cube cloud to run all the analysis. So it's pretty user-friendly, easy to use, lightweight on your machine. Of course, it's not free. Now, measuring accessibility is one thing, but actually using the accessibility metrics to make decisions is another. And as I mentioned, this is something we work a lot with here at SSTI. We often think about the uses in 6 ways. You can scan existing conditions. So like using the maps that I showed earlier, you can see where accessibility is good, where it's bad. You can diagnose problems. So if you see a gap in accessibility, you can sort of hone in on that gap and try to understand why folks might not have good accessibility in that location. You can assess solutions. So if you come up with a potential project to address a gap in accessibility, you can actually model it into one of these tools and see how it changes accessibility for folks. It's good for engaging stakeholders. As I think you'll see, the measures are pretty intuitive and easy to understand. So you can communicate with the public, you can communicate among practitioners using a common language. You can track performance over time. So if your region sets accessibility goals, you can actually measure accessibility on a year-to-year basis and see if you're moving in the right direction. And you can predict outcomes. Accessibility happens to be very closely related to things like household VMT, mode share, active transportation, health, land values. All kinds of things that we'd really like to see our transportation systems facilitating a lot of the time. So we can, in many cases, sort of translate accessibility into these different types of outcomes. One of the best examples of accessibility measures put into practice is Virginia's Smart Scale. So Virginia has this project prioritization process where all major transportation projects have to be scored based on a handful of criteria, accessibility being one of them. So round 1 for this project scoring was in 2015, and that year they measured access to jobs by driving and transit for all the transportation projects. Round 2 last year, a walking methodology was developed, so that included access to jobs by walking. The next round is likely to include a non-work accessibility measure, like the one I showed earlier. This is something that we worked with the state very closely with to develop. And future directions could include things like bike accessibility and other advancements in accessibility measurement. So how important is it to measure these pedestrian connections, right? In the scheme of things, when we're measuring access to jobs by driving and transit, how important is this pedestrian piece? Well, to answer that, let's take another look at the metrics in Northern Virginia. This is access to jobs by transit at Tyson's Corner in Northern Virginia. And you can see pretty clearly here that the accessibility is highest near the metro stations, right? And this is probably pretty obvious. What's going on here is folks that are near the train stations can hop on the subway and pretty easily access jobs that are in DC and other major job centers along the transit lines. If we zoom in around some of those stations, we can see that folks that are living really close to the station can actually access close to 480,000 jobs during that morning commute period. And just a little bit further away, they can only access about half that, right? And that's because every extra 5, 10, 15 minutes that it takes to get to the station before you can even get on the subway is really reducing the number of jobs that you can reach within a reasonable amount of time. And that's based on those decay functions that I mentioned earlier. So your ability to get to the station is going to be really important in what your transit accessibility is. We can look in on this Route 123 here, and we see there's actually buses running along this road as well, in addition to the subways. That's why there's some medium level of accessibility all on that corridor. But what you'll notice here is that there's actually houses on both sides of the street, bus stops along the south edge here, and no formal way to cross the street. There's no crosswalks or signals there. So short of running through traffic, those folks living to the north can't actually access those bus stops that are there. What we can do is we can go in and say we're going to add some crossings, and we want to see how that will affect people's accessibility. So what you're seeing in the map now is how access to jobs by transit changes when we make this change in the network, adding those pedestrian connections. And you can see for the neighborhood right there to the north, they can access another 5,000 or so jobs by transit just through their ability to cross the street there. And obviously there's more impacts in the other adjacent neighborhoods as well. So you can sort of add up the total impacts of a change like that. We can do the same thing with the non-work accessibility. This is showing the town of Vienna, just a little bit south of Tyson's Corner. You see, non-work accessibility is pretty good there because they have access to lots of different types of destinations by walking. But if we take a look at the conditions there, we see there are some opportunities for spot improvements. Again, along that Route 123 there's some places where there might be additional crossings added. There's also a bike trail that connects downtown, but in certain places, like right here, it doesn't actually connect to the nearby neighborhoods. So these are little connections we can make to improve walking accessibility in the area. And again, we can see how that would affect non-work accessibility. So some folks experience an increase of 5 points in non-work accessibility. And again, that's out of a possible 100-point scale. So that's a pretty significant bump for those folks. We could compare and rank the different projects. So we could run, this is showing all the projects at once, but we could compare each one separately and see which one has the biggest impact, which projects might be the biggest bang for the buck. And we can start to prioritize our pedestrian improvements that way. So to this point, I've sort of said we can add a pedestrian link and see how it affects accessibility. There's a little more nuance to that, so I just wanted to go in really briefly into how we code pedestrian accessibility in the network. And this is still some work in progress. In the tool that we use, Sugar Access, there's already a pedestrian level of service concept incorporated into the tool. And this is sort of to account for the fact that some roads are going to be better for people to walk along than others. There's a lot going on here, but if you look at the far lower left corner, you see a local road with low speed traffic on it, only 2 lanes, is going to perform pretty well. So walking along that road, we assume, is going to be pretty comfortable and safe and pleasant. Compared to as you move towards roads with higher speeds, more lanes, you move into major arterials and freeways, those roads are going to be less walkable. So as we get up into those higher, those levels C's and D's, we reduce the speed, the walking speed, by as much as 50%, right? So this is not to say that people are actually going to walk slower on those roads, but it's adding an impedance that sort of represents the fact that folks aren't going to be able to get places quite as easier or easily as or as comfortable along those routes with the major traffic and the many lanes and all that. So that's automatically built in, and that's for folks walking along a particular road. We were working on a pilot project here in Madison to understand the crossings as well. Take a look at the first column that's called no impedance. This is basically just to say that if you have a road that's only 2 lanes or less, low speeds, there is a crosswalk, but there's no traffic signal, we assume that that's going to be a pretty easy road to cross. You won't experience an impedance for trying to cross that road. So we apply a level of service factor of 1. So basically that says your walking speed is not going to be affected by trying to cross that road. The next column is a full impedance. So let's say you're trying to cross a 4-lane road with speeds greater than 25 miles an hour, no crosswalk and no signal. Essentially, that is a crossing that's unreasonable for someone to try and cross. So in these cases, we assign a level of service factor of 0. Essentially, what it does is it turns off the crossing. When we're modeling accessibility, someone is no longer allowed to walk across that part of the network. And then there's stuff in the middle with partial impedances. One that was pretty easy to tackle was if there's a traffic signal and we want to apply a 30 to 90 second penalty for folks having to wait at that signal until their time to cross. That's pretty easy to code into the accessibility measurements. Then there's a whole range of stuff, 2 to 4 lane roads with higher speeds. There are crosswalks, but no traffic signals. There might be varying impedances that we'd want to apply to those crossings. So part of the work that still remains is figuring out what those impedances might be. For now, in most of our analyses, we're just turning those links off. And I think Jennifer and Spencer are going to explain a little bit more in their bike accessibility tool why that might make sense to just turn off most of those crossings. Here's what the network looks like in ArcMap with the network that we get with Sugar Access. You can see the links in orange and the nodes in white. And imagine someone's trying to cross that east-west road. What we do is we take a look at the links at those crossings. In this case, this one is 6 lanes. Car speeds are 35 miles an hour. There is a crosswalk and there is a signal. So we're just going to apply a 90-second penalty. So we come up with this level of service factor. And basically what that is saying how slow are we going to say that someone has to walk to cross that. We basically slow down their walking speed to 5% of what they would have been walking. And this equates to adding an additional 90 seconds for them to cross. So basically all we've done is say, if they want to cross that road, it's going to cost them an extra 90 seconds. We look at the intersection a little bit further down, and you see it's pretty much the same characteristics, except there's no crosswalk, no signal. So what this says to us is this is basically an impassable connection for pedestrians. So we turn it off. We assign a level of service factor of 0. So anybody over on that east side that wants to cross the street is going to have to walk over to that western intersection and then also endure that 90-second penalty to wait for the crossings. So things like this are going to affect our pedestrian accessibility quite a bit when we do these analyses. There's still a little bit of some areas where the network is not quite up to speed to do these types of analyses that we want to do. So we have to do some coding by hand. So this is the existing network. We're interested again in people trying to cross this road. But you see there's none of those little links for people to walk across. There's just the white dots, which are nodes. We have to apply our factors to links. So we've had to go in some places and draw in extra links. So this red line represents sort of the sidewalk and the crossings on the north side of the street. So now we've got like a two-way pair of links representing people that might be walking on the north side of the road and the south side of the road. And then we get those little crossing links that we can then assign some of these impedance factors to. This is a 4-lane road with 25-mile-per-hour speeds. There is a crosswalk and there is a signal. So again, we're going to apply a 90-second impedance. And that comes out to, we're going to slow speeds down to 2.5% of what they would have been walking. All that does is add a 90-second penalty for people trying to get across that. So just to summarize, we've got plenty of opportunities to incorporate pedestrian accessibility at multiple levels of decision making. That includes in planning phases, project selection, as with Smart Scale in Virginia, and even in the design phase of things. We can start to see how accessibility could play into decision making at all these levels. There's a growing variety of data and tools. We've highlighted some. There are probably more out there I haven't mentioned. And there's ongoing work. We still need to work with better network data and make sure we're doing quality assurance whenever we're doing these really fine-grained pedestrian analyses. We'd love to understand some of those pedestrian level of service concepts and establish some other best practices. This is a lot of stuff that we're working on with agencies like Virginia and other state DOTs. And another opportunity is there is coming on fairly soon bike and pedestrian trip making data from companies like Streetlight Data. And this is data that's coming from people's handheld devices and smartphones. And we're getting to the point where companies like Streetlight Data are saying, we can actually tell from the data that we're getting from these smartphone carriers when we think people are walking and biking. And then we can start to understand what trips these folks are actually taking. And this might help us understand the development of those level of service standards, because we can see what routes people are actually taking and start to apply better metrics to those links in the network. So if you're interested in this, contact Streetlight Data, or we've got some more materials on our website. So, and that's all I've got. So Robbie, if you want to turn things back over.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to switch all of this over to Jennifer and Spencer, and they're going to tell us about their project. And I think you guys should now have control of the slides.
Thanks, Robbie. This is Jennifer Boldry. As Robbie said, I'm Director of Research for People for Bikes. For those of you not familiar with us, we're a national advocacy organization dedicated to getting more people on bikes more often. And one of the ways we do that is through programs designed specifically to help communities build better places for bikes. So the tool we're going to talk about today, the Places for Bikes Bike Network Analysis, which we call the BNA, is part of that effort. And just to give you a sense of how the presentation will flow, I'm going to start out with a little bit of background and then turn it over to Spencer to give you an overview of methodology, and then we'll wrap up with some examples of how you use the BNA. So those of us who ride on a regular or semi-regular basis have probably had an experience sort of like this. When you're riding along and you're perfectly happy in your bike lane, everything's comfortable, and then all of a sudden it ends. And hopefully it doesn't end right into a guardrail like in this picture, but often it does end right into, you know, some traffic or something that's super uncomfortable. And so the Bike Network Analysis tool was designed to address these kinds of issues. With support from our founding sponsor, Trek Bicycles, we partnered with Toole Design Group to build the BNA. It measures how easy it is for people to comfortably get the places they want to go by bike. The underlying goals are really to encourage cities of all sizes to move away from thinking about building individual facilities and focus on building entire connected, comfortable bike networks. We hope that it lowers the barrier to basic network analysis, helps cities identify the weak links in the network and address them, quantify the quality of the bike network in a way that's comparable so that cities can track improvements to the bike network over time. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Spencer to walk you through a little bit about the methodology of the BNA.
Thanks, Jennifer. Make sure I can control the screen here. So I want to thank Chris, first of all, for describing some of the logic behind measuring accessibility. And what we're going to do here is talk about how the BNA specifically measures accessibility, and we'll go through a couple of examples to illustrate how that works. But the concepts are roughly the same as what Chris talked about. So first of all, the BNA is based on a concept called bicycle level of traffic stress. Some of you may be familiar with this. This is a method for rating the suitability of a roadway for bicyclists based on the 4 types of cyclists that have been identified first by Roger Geller in Portland and has later been supported by research from Jennifer Dill. So we can break the world into 4 different types. And on the far end, you have the strong and fearless. Those are people who are if not comfortable, at least willing to ride in circumstances that most people would not be comfortable in, with high levels of traffic and potentially high speeds. You have enthused and confident. These would be people that generally have experience riding and are comfortable mixing with traffic as long as it's at reasonable speeds, and especially if there's a little bit of space dedicated to bicycling. Then you have interested but concerned. These would be people who would like to get out and ride more, but probably do not feel comfortable mixing with cars, especially in a high speed or a high traffic environment. The last that the level of traffic stress methodology addresses is 8 to 80. So these are really facilities that anybody can ride on. A child or your grandmother, anybody would be comfortable on these facilities. The BNA is really focused on the low stress end of this spectrum. So the interested but concerned and 8 to 80. There are good reasons to make investments in your bike network to address the needs of, say, the enthused and confident, or even the strong and fearless. But our primary concern is making sure that people who maybe don't feel comfortable currently biking feel comfortable, and that they have that complete network that Jennifer talked about for getting to where they want to go. So the way that the bicycle level of traffic stress methodology works, we look at two different characteristics of the road. And I should add, this is a somewhat condensed methodology. The original is somewhat more complex, but also relies on some data that we just could not get access to and often doesn't exist. So our focus here is on segments. So what's happening between intersections. And the primary considerations for how stressful that road is are the speed limit, whether or not there's a bike facility, and the number of travel lanes. So higher speeds leads to higher stress. High numbers of, or a lot of travel lanes leads to higher stress, presumably because you have more cars driving on that segment. Also because the additional lanes can create, you could think of it almost as turbulence, extra complexity on the roadway that adds to that stress level. And then the bike facility, depending on the type of facility, you could have something that makes you feel very comfortable despite high speeds or high levels of traffic. Or you may be lacking a facility, and so even if the speed is low, but maybe there's a high number of cars, you're not feeling comfortable there. We also are concerned with crossing. So when you approach an intersection, you need to cross a roadway, and again, we're looking at characteristics to determine whether that crossing is stressful or not. And the characteristics we look at are the speed limit of the cross traffic. So high-speed traffic on the crossroad increases your stress, makes you less comfortable crossing that road. The intersection control and crossing treatments, if there's a traffic signal, for example, then cross traffic is stopped by definition. And so that creates a low-stress crossing, assuming that you're being taken care of on the approach and the exit of the intersection. And then the number of lanes to cross, and that's basically the more distance you have to go, the more you're exposed to traffic. So a shorter crossing in the form of fewer number of lanes is less stressful. The other important piece that the level of traffic stress methodology emphasizes is the concept of the weakest link. So if you imagine an origin and destination here, all it takes is one small section of that trip being stressful to rule out the possibility of certain types of users making that trip at all. So if I'm on the left of the screen here and I'm trying to go to grandma's house on the right, and I have to traverse maybe a couple of blocks of high speed or a high volume traffic, that trip might very well not occur. I may decide not to do that, even though the rest of the trip is perfectly comfortable. And again, this is especially targeted to those interested but concerned and 8 to 80 users who are more sensitive to those considerations. So that in this example, that trip would not occur. You would need to have a continuous low stress connection. So that's the way that we're rating the roadway or the bike network. I want to talk about how we measure access to destinations. And like I said, this is very similar to what Chris talked about. And I should also credit Reed Sibley at WSP for the images that I kind of built this off of. I felt it was a really good way to illustrate. So thanks to him. I don't know if he's on this call, but this was based on his work. This is the car network. If you imagine each square is a place that you can get to, the whole network is gray, meaning you can access that whole network. By definition, a road network is accessible to every piece of a road network is accessible to a car. The bike network, by contrast, may not be entirely accessible. So you can see the grayed out pieces that are accessible to a bike starting in the middle of this square. A couple of things to notice. The first is there are areas that simply don't have service because there may not be a suitable bike facility or because the roads are high stress. The other thing you'll notice on the edges on the left and right is that even though the bike network does technically serve that location, in order to reach that area from the middle of the grid, you have to go so far out of your way that we don't consider that to be access. We'll do an example here. This is considering schools. So you can see where the schools are distributed. Again, the networks are, or at least the geographic location is the same. The network is different because of the different modes. So the car network has access to 5 schools. Again, you have access to everything on the car network by definition. On the bike network, you only have access to 2 schools in this chart. A couple of the additional schools are actually served by bike facilities, but you have to go so far out of your way. You effectively cannot access those. So the way that we measure this score in the BNA is first we want to give weight to the first of any destination type that you can reach, recognizing that getting access to the first school near you is probably more important than getting access to the 5th school that's near you. So those first destinations of any of the categories are worth more points. That second school then would give you 20 points instead of the 30 that the first school gives you. We can add those up to get 50 points, and that would be the score for the school metric in the BNA. We've divided the destinations that we consider into 6 different categories. So the first is people. That is the population that you can reach within a bikeable distance on the low stress network. The second is opportunity, and that covers things like jobs, schools, universities, basically economic opportunities. Core services would cover things like grocery stores, doctors, hospitals, things that provide important services to the population. Retail, as it says, retail opportunities, places where you can shop. Recreation covers items like parks and recreational trails. And then transit covers high capacity or important transit centers. So in that measure, we're mostly focused on either train stations or bus depots where you have multiple lines converging. Just to give you an example, and we'll use opportunity as the example here. You could have, and this is just a theoretical example, a location where the employment score works out to 28 out of 100, the K-12 education score works out to 50 out of 100, and for the remaining 2 you have 100 out of 100. That score would then be averaged up to 57 out of 100. We're doing this same thing across all of these categories to give you scores for each category, and then ultimately we roll those up to a single overall score for a particular location. So in other words, you can see how you rate for any of the categories, and you can also see how you rate in kind of an overall sense. And Jennifer's going to point out how you can access some of that data and how you might be able to use it.
Great, thanks, Spencer. I appreciate it. And just as a reminder, if you do have questions, you're welcome to type those into the chat, and we'll answer them either afterwards or after the webinar if we don't have time during the webinar. So the results of the first round of analysis are available on our website, which is peopleforbikes.org/BNA. This first year we ran just under 300 cities. And that was again for 2017. Those results are available on our website. Our plan is to rerun BNA scores for a handful of cities who participate in our Places for Bikes program on an annual basis. So the next round will probably be released sometime in the spring. I just want to run you through quickly, where the results are and what they look like and how you can look at them. So again, that website is peopleforbikes.org/BNA. And this is an example of a stress map. So this is a map of Madison, Wisconsin. They scored a 50 out of 100 on the VNA. Again, 100 is 100% connectivity, just like the road network. And most of the cities, the best cities in the U.S., best reasonable sized cities in the U.S., scored right around the mid-50s. There were a few that were a bit higher than that. But you can see the overall score for the BNA, you can see the population total for Madison, and then you can see the scores for each one of those subset categories like core services or connection to people or opportunity and so on. You can also click on key destinations. So if you look at that layer button up there in the right-hand corner and click on that, you can pick any of those key destinations like opportunity, dentists, doctors, etc. In this example, I selected schools. And then you can look at that destination marker, and it provides information about the number of people that are within a bikeable distance of that location. And for the purposes of the BNA, we defined a bikeable distance as about a 10-minute bike ride or 1 2/3 of a mile. So it will tell you how many people can reach that destination in total and how many people can reach that destination comfortably by bike. And the percent of those total who can reach that destination who can get there comfortably. So you can get a sense of the access score for particular destinations as well as for the city overall. This particular view, and you can also select this in the layer button on the right, shows just the bike facilities, excluding the roads, and the legend is there at the bottom. This view is one of my favorites. This is the census block view. It's essentially a heat map of the BNA scores, where the blue indicates areas of the city that are very well connected, and the orange indicates areas that are less well connected or disconnected, rather. And so you can see for Madison that there's a lot of really great connection right in the middle. And where the city suffers is on the edge parts there, where it's difficult for people to get places comfortably by bike. You can also compare up to 3 places on the website. So in this example, I selected Madison, Boise, and Albuquerque. You can take a look at the overall BNA scores and then the score and each of the sub-scores. All of the raw data are available for download. So if you click that download button that's circled or squared with the red there on the left, you'll see that you can download in a bunch of different formats, download that raw data and import it into GIS software for a bunch of other deeper or different kinds of analyses. And I will turn it back to Spencer very quickly to walk us through some examples of what you can do with the raw data.
Yeah, thank you. I'm actually going to backtrack just for a second to point out a couple of other technical details. The first is, if you look at this map, you can see that our unit of analysis is census blocks. So we're grabbing the census blocks defined by the US Census, and that's where we're performing our analysis. So you do see the irregular boundaries, and that's an artifact of the US Census. We felt that was the best geography or the geographic unit to conduct the analysis on. It gives us some level of granularity, but we're not getting down to the address level. The other piece is that the overall city score is weighted by population. So you may have a few neighborhoods that score really, really well, as Madison does through the isthmus and in the center of the screen there, but a large portion of the population lives out on the far west or far east sides, and those neighborhoods generally score poorly, and that is really what's dragging Madison's score down in this particular instance. So while improvements to connectivity in the isthmus and the kind of central area may improve biking for lots of residents, if the emphasis is on making biking better for all of your residents, this illustrates that there may be some areas that are overlooked that could receive some improvements and really improve the biking experience for large portions of the population. So now how can we use this? We ran some examples. One of the things you can do, you can't see this on the website, but you can do this with the downloaded data, would be to examine a bike shed. So in the example of Longview, Texas on the left, we chose one census block and mapped the low stress bike shed compared to the high stress bike shed for that location. And what you can see in red is that those areas are not accessible by bike, but would be accessible by car within the same bikeable distance. And the areas that are in sort of bluish green are accessible on the low stress network. What you can see here is really the effect of those arterial roads that bound that area that really cut off access to areas outside of them. So there's probably an issue with crossing those roads that is hindering the accessibility. In addition, you have a somewhat discontinuous street network. And so accessing some of the neighborhoods across requires you to traverse the busier roads for some distance in order to get to a cross street. This is an interesting example we ran internationally. This is Groningen in the Netherlands. It's known as a very bikeable city, kind of a university town. And you can see here, the scale I don't think is exactly the same, but roughly so. And you can see that the majority of the area within that central census block that we've highlighted is accessible on the low stress network. And that's true across the whole city of Groningen. And if you're interested, the overall score of Groningen was 75. We also ran this for a few other cities. Another example you might be interested in is Copenhagen, which scored 82. Hopefully that sets your expectations for what a maximum score looks like. Groningen and Copenhagen are known as very bike-friendly cities, and even they didn't score 100. As Jennifer points out, 100 out of 100 would mean that literally everything on your network is 100% accessible by bike for somebody who is sensitive to traffic stress. And even the best cities in the world are not quite there yet. As Jennifer mentioned, for American cities, we're looking at more in the 50s and 60s range as being pretty good. And we still have a lot of room to go in most cities. You can see that on the BNA website. Another thing you can do is look at the intersection stress. If you look at this street grid, for example, you'll notice that the intersections, some of the intersections are colored red. That really illustrates where the gaps are. So on the street on the right, for example, you have low stress connections on either side of East 22nd Street, which is the street that runs east to west through the middle of the screen. That street is a low stress street, but the crossing of East 22nd Street is not considered to be low stress. And this highlights those gaps. That's another aspect of the downloaded data that you could map. It's not as visible on the website. And I don't know, Jennifer, if you had anything else to add.
Yeah, I just have a couple of really brief conclusions and a little bit of an ask, perhaps. So the accuracy of the BNA is really dependent on the quality of data available in OpenStreetMap, which is the base map we use for the tool. To get the most accurate scores for a city, OpenStreetMap has to have the most updated information about roadways, including speed limits and number of lanes, including intersection characteristics, bike facilities, and importantly, those key destinations. We provided resources on our website to help cities update their OpenStreetMap data. And where we've seen it be really successful is when cities partner with academics or local OSM communities, tech communities, and advocacy organizations to really get it going. Just as an example, we hosted, in collaboration with Madison Bikes, we hosted a mapathon in Madison to get Madison's OSM data completely up to date so that their score could be as accurate as possible. And for the cost of beer and pizza, in about 3 hours, we got that map updated. So we'd like to get your help in making sure that the OSM is as accurate as it can possibly be. You know, our goal as People for Bikes is that the BNA really helps cities accelerate their progress in building those connected, comfortable bike networks all across the country. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Robbie. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Even though I knew most of this information, I still find it very, very interesting to listen to how these are being done. And we're going to go ahead and take some questions. Reminder that if you need to ask a question, just type it into the chat box. And if you don't see the chat box, go ahead and look for the orange arrow in the upper right-hand side of the screen, and the chat box should appear. So again, these slides will be up, and the recording will be up tomorrow on the SSTI website. So if you need any of these email addresses or to look back on any of the information, if you couldn't take notes, we'll have those available for you. So also, I do want to invite people to subscribe to the SSTI newsletter, to follow us on Twitter, and to visit our website. We'll be having some more webinars coming up, and we've got lots of information about accessibility and trip making coming up, and lots of other topics that I think will be interesting to this audience.
So I can start fielding some questions here. This is Chris McCahill again, and I've been watching them come in. We've got a few that have to do with some of the technical decisions around some of the stuff I showed earlier, actually, about assigning pedestrian level of service to different links, knowing whether or not someone should be able to cross when there's a crosswalk or not, those types of questions. I'll just say generally that even though we didn't show it in some of the tables, there were some links in the network that we could very easily turn off for pedestrians to use, limited access highways, and places where we know that there's actually no pedestrian facilities, sidewalks or otherwise. Those all typically get turned off in the network. And then there's all that stuff in the middle, like what is a 6-lane road with a really narrow sidewalk? How do we know how that falls in terms of pedestrian level service? And the answer sort of at this point is we don't. And this really comes down to a policy decision and what you want to be able to use the tool for. And I think Spencer and Jennifer illustrated this really well by describing how they wanted to focus on the low stress network. So if your policy goal is to build out a network that everyone can walk on or bike on with the lowest level of stress, then any link that does not meet those minimum criteria essentially would be turned off in the analysis. And then if you were evaluating projects, you could see whether projects bring the network up to speed in terms of adding crossings where there aren't any, or adding a signal where there should be one, or adding a bike lane where there ought to be one. So that's all I wanted to say about that, and I'll see if any other folks wanted to add anything. Seems not. I'll jump to another question about, so one maybe quick question is, do the scores account for, I know this is on here somewhere, I can't find the wording, but the grade on streets. And I think this is specific to bike topography. Anything you wanted to add there, Spencer?
Sure. Yeah, elevation or topography is one element that we know can affect somebody's decision or comfort level on a bicycle. In this first stage of the BNA, we have not included or accounted for elevation. So that is something that we would love to add in the future. In some ways, we're treating this almost as a beta product. We want to make some improvements to the scores, and this first round is an opportunity for us to get feedback about how accurate the scores are, whether it's capturing how people actually feel about their places, and then we'll be making some of those improvements in the future. And I know that elevation is something that Jennifer and I have talked about, so that is definitely on People for Bikes' radar.
Thanks.
And I would just add to that, if I could. This is Jennifer. You know, in addition we did make some assumptions about the data or about conditions on the ground when data were missing from the OSM. You know, and those assumptions can have impacts on the overall scores for neighborhoods and cities. So again, getting that data updated will help us make sure that we get the most accurate information, you know, and also getting more information and feedback from people using the BNA around, you know, whether those assumptions are valid is helpful for us.
Great, thank you. I see a couple questions in here that are all along the same lines, and you kind of addressed it when you were showing the international examples, but what would a 100 score look like? Why is DC a 35? Why is Boston a 17? Questions like this. Before you answer, I'll just say that this was something we wrestled with developing our non-work accessibility score, where places could score between a 0 or 100. We are involved in designing that score, and we purposely set it so that no place would score 100, because depending on the use of these scores, you would, in theory, want every place to be able to have projects that could move the needle on accessibility. So just because a place scores a 50 doesn't mean that it's doing that poorly. It might be a really small town where a 50 makes sense. But go ahead and jump in on the BNA.
Sure. So,
go ahead, Spencer.
I think there could be a couple of things at play in any one city, and so it's hard to comment on a specific situation. First of all, as Jennifer notes, we're really bound by the quality of the OpenStreetMap data that we have. So to the extent that that data is can be updated with the latest bike infrastructure and roadway characteristics, some of those scores may improve, or there may be some locations where scores actually decrease. Another element to consider is often you'll have a city that's known as a good biking city, and I pointed this out in Madison because we're known as a good biking city. I'm based in Madison, and there are still lots of areas in the city that are simply not comfortable for cyclists of all ages and abilities, and those interested but concerned cyclists. So while there may be some locations that are really great, and Madison has a lot of really great areas for biking, the score shows us that there's a lot of work to be done. And especially in those locations that are kind of far away from the public consciousness, especially for maybe like a visitor to Madison that doesn't get out and see some of the further out neighborhoods that are not as comfortable for biking as some of the central neighborhoods that have really high quality infrastructure. So that could be at play in DC or Boston. Like I said, it's really hard to know because there are several different factors at play.
And I would just add to that, if I could, from People for Bikes perspective, we really wanted to set the bar pretty high. The road network is 100% accessible. You never get in your car wondering if you're going to be able to get to the place you want to go. You might wonder if there's going to be traffic or other things, but you never wonder if it's possible. And we think that alternate mode choices should work the same way. You should be able to get where you want to go. And, we've learned several things about, what are the key elements of connectivity. Keep in mind that we are talking about connectivity to key destinations. So land use makes a difference. We see in the BNA results some very small towns who get very high BNA scores, not because lots of people bike there, right? We're not measuring how many people bike. We're measuring the quality of the network. And in these small places, what happens is all of the key destinations are sort of right in the middle of town, where there's lots of neighborhood roads with very low volume, very low number of travel lanes and speed limits. So it would be very easy to get to the places you want to go by bike in those areas. One of the other things that we've really seen is that intersections matter. We set that weakest link criteria that Spencer described. So you could have a really great bike lane and be perfectly comfortable for 90% of the ride, but if it drops off right before you cross that intersection and the intersection is really sketchy, That's not a low stress connection. So I think these are issues that have come out as we've worked through the BNA with some local stakeholders. And, you know, our hope is that the BNA helps to elevate some of those conversations.
Great, thanks. We've got one question came in fairly recently about, especially in regard to the pedestrian accessibility, a question about ADA accessibility and how this is handled. I think that's a great question. It's something we've thought a lot about, especially in terms of transit accessibility, right? There's lots of transit stations that aren't ADA accessible. And the same goes with pedestrian crossings and pedestrian sidewalks and links. I think modeling these types of things would be super easy to do. It would be easy to find out if any given connection is not ADA accessible and treat it accordingly. The biggest challenge there is the data. So if any region doing an accessibility analysis had good data about where ADA accessibility was where it should be, it would be easy enough to incorporate that into an accessibility measure. And I think that that ought to be done. Again, as with many of these things, in most cases, the data isn't there yet. Question from someone that sounds like they might be interested in helping build some of the OSM data here. When Madison did the Mapathon, what data did they use? Did they use aerial photography, their own judgment? Was their task to get data or improve existing data? So anybody want to speak to that?
Yeah, I can talk about that. So OpenStreetMap, for those who aren't familiar, is you can think of it almost as like a Wikipedia, but for maps. Anybody can go in and edit the map, make updates to something they see that is either missing in the map or needs to be changed. So it's really an open platform, and they have pretty high standards for what they accept as data. First of all, for legal reasons, you may not use something like Google Maps to transfer data into OpenStreetMap. So we weren't able to just have like a Google Map up or Street View and kind of walk along the street, so to speak, to see the bike infrastructure that was there. That's not allowed, you know, for legal reasons. What we ended up doing was talking with the MPO here in Madison, who has good data on the bike network here and on street infrastructure in general. We were able to put together some map layers that and got, you know, the necessary legal permissions from them to incorporate that into OpenStreetMap. So mappers were looking at the MPO data and then updating something in OpenStreetMap if they noticed a discrepancy. There's also a lot of emphasis in OpenStreetMap on on-the-ground knowledge. So we made sure that we had the bike advocacy group here, Madison Bikes, heavily involved, because those are cyclists that know the conditions on the ground. They know where the bike lanes end or where there's a missing connection. And in some cases, the MPO data wasn't perfect, but we had people who knew the local conditions that were able to say, yes, there's a bike lane there, or no, that bike lane is planned but not existing. So kind of a tag team effort on the part of different groups. And like I said, pulling in information from the MPO that was willing to let us use their data.
And we're preparing, on that note, we are preparing sort of a how to do a Mapathon that has some of this guidance in it, and we'll be sharing that on our website, you know, probably within the next month or so.
Great, and I think we've got some more technical questions that probably aren't going to get answered, so do feel free to reach out to any of us and we can help you answer those questions. But I think in the interest of time, respecting folks' time, we're just going to take one last question. And it has to do with if you were to try to explain these network measurements to a community group, which would be the most understandable? And I'll just start just saying generally that as I mentioned early on, I think one of the great things about accessibility measures in general is that they are much easier to understand for folks than some of the more traditional transportation performance measures like level of service. Someone might not always understand what their road level of service means to them and how it affects their daily life. But they can understand things like how many jobs can I reach, how many opportunities can I reach? So I think that's one of the great benefits of these measures. And we've tried ground truthing, the ones that we've been using with communities in Virginia as we work with the state there to develop some of their metrics for project prioritization. And generally, speaking to all kinds of different audiences, city councils and things like that, the metrics generally are really easy to understand. And I think we're not measuring anything new that isn't out there. I think we're turning it into a new way of communicating how the system meets our needs. So that's kind of my take on the measures in general, but go ahead and pick it up from there.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to describe it. I don't know who the original source is for this, but some of you may be familiar with the popsicle rule, which is can a child walk 10 minutes to the store and back and get a popsicle to eat on a hot summer day? As a kind of rule of thumb measurement for how well connected your neighborhood is. And again, that gets to, as Jennifer was talking about, there's a land use component here too. If there's nothing around you, or the things that are around you are placed in locations that are not accessible to you, then your neighborhood is not accessible. And that is a question that goes beyond just the transportation system. So what we're really, what we're hoping to measure here is, as Chris said, access. What can you actually, what destinations can you arrive to in a manner that does not make you feel stressed?
I think that's a great, great wrap up. And I want to thank Chris and Jennifer and Spencer for a wonderful webinar. Again, they're all available if you have further questions, especially if you have technical questions. There's a lot of methodology that goes into all of this. And I know that both People for Bikes, Toole Design, and SSTI are working very hard to improve all the methodology and the availability of these measures. So I think everybody will be very interested in talking to anyone who'd like to contact us after the webinar. And thank you for everyone for joining us. Again, we'll have these slides and a recording of the webinar up on the website tomorrow, and let us know if you have any questions. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.